Hello everyone, this is Rebecca Arvin with the Water Environment Federation. I want to welcome each of you to the user fee funded Stormwater Utilities update to the 1994 WEF Manual Webcast, jointly sponsored by Arcadis, Black & Veatch, and CH2M Hill. Before we begin, I would like to quickly review a few logistics. All of the PDF PowerPoint presentations are available for downloading at WEF's FTP link. This link was distributed via email yesterday and will be distributed again for tomorrow for anyone that registered after the time of distribution. The FTP link for this webcast also has information on how to receive professional development hours for those eligible to receive these training credits. There are 2 PDH credits for this webcast. You will need to complete the evaluation form to receive the PDH certificate. Your feedback on this webcast is important and helps identify future webcast topics that are timely and helpful to you. Please follow the PDH instructions and check with your state accreditation agency on how to receive this credit. During this webcast, while you cannot speak directly to the presenters, you will, however, have an opportunity to submit questions by typing in your specific question via the pane that appears on your PC. Lawrence Vandertak will be accumulating questions and direct them to the presenters throughout the webcast. We will be recording this webcast. A link will be sent to all registered users tomorrow so that you can share it with other colleagues who could not attend the webcast. If you have any additional questions after the webcast is ended, please email webcasts with an S at wef.org. I also wanted to let all of you know that there is a discount for attendees of this webcast. You can receive 20% off the user fee funded Stormwater Programs publication by using the promo code on the screen. Before we get started, I have a poll question for everyone. Let me go ahead and launch that question. The question is, how many people are participating in the webcast today at your computer? If you're participating by yourself, please respond 1. If you're participating in a conference room, for example, or have several people gathered around your computer, just do a quick head count. Looks like we have about 80%. I'll just keep it open for a few more seconds to get some more people to vote. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. And I'll go ahead and share those results. It looks like we have about 91% participating by themselves today. So I'd like to thank Mike Matidich for speaking first on the webcast today. He will start by explaining the topics of today's webcast and introducing the additional webcast speakers as we proceed throughout the presentations. Mike is the Global Service Lead for Financial Analysis at CH2M Hill. Mike?
Thank you, Rebecca. In addition to me, we'll have 3 other speakers in the webcast. So the initial slide here is just showing an overview of the agenda for the couple hours that we'll have together. I'll be giving an overview of the presentation. Prabha Kumar will be discussing feasibility stage studies. Pete Yakimovich will be talking about program evaluation. Lawrence Vandertak will be giving an overview of the case studies that were developed, and then we'll have a question and answer period. And I will be, as Rebecca indicated, giving more detailed introductions to the other speakers as we get to their parts in the presentation. So this first piece then is an overview of the 2013 special publication. And I'll be discussing essentially the background to the publication, why it has been developed now, what it is not, who the intended audience is. Then I'll be providing an overview of the document, of the different sections of it, and then I'll be giving some highlights of some of the sections that we weren't able to feature in detail in the webcast. I mean, the document has quite a few chapters and case studies, and we're not able to feature everything in this webcast, but I'll be giving a few highlights from some of the sections that we're not able to give full presentations to. Why now? Well, much has changed since WEF last developed a publication related to user fee funded stormwater utilities. You can see my a copy of my slightly dog-eared edges around my copy of that document. Both stormwater programs have changed. In the 1990s, flood control was the focus for many of the programs. Now there's a much broader array of program components and a need to arrange and orient the fee structures and fee programs to address that. And as many of you who are in this arena know, that the legal context has changed both through evolving statutes and legislation by states and local agencies, but also through case law and through just the evolution of the context within user fee programs are created. And really there's been a pretty limited literature since 1994, but a much greater experience base based on the fact that there are quite a few existing fee programs, though not 100% of all entities, as I'm sure many of you in the audience are coming from jurisdictions that do not yet have a user fee funded program in place. And then really there's been significant evolution in technologies and GIS systems and billing systems, financial models, communication systems. Just as a couple of sort of examples of that is remote sensing capabilities really weren't available or were sort of widely in use in 1994, but now really provide opportunities to for accuracy and efficiency that, in detailing and evaluating parcels that just didn't exist in 1994. And again, some of the case studies and sections of the document sort of showcase some of those features. Web technologies and social media really were not widely available as methods to communicate with stakeholders or to organize information, back at the time of the original document. And it really sort of shapes the way we think about communicating and reaching out to both stakeholders and with peer professionals. Webcasts like the one that we're on right now, really this technology wasn't really in place back in 1994. In terms of what is covered in the document, the author team sort of worked off of initial outline and had some pretty significant dialogue about what to include in the document, and really decided that we would focus on user fee program development and implementation, both the policy issues, the rate structure and credit program options, the evolving legal issues and context, stakeholder engagement, program evaluation, and the creation of a library of case studies that include both some fairly recently organized and formed user fee funded programs, but also some that have been in existence for a while and offer some useful insights in terms of the evolution of user fee funded programs. In terms of what's not covered, again, we wanted to focus the attention of this document on those areas where there was really a deficit in the literature, and so we decided not to cover in any detail wastewater user fees, cost of service methodologies as applied to wastewater systems, even though we know that and recognize that that in a number of communities, wastewater user fees are used as the basis for paying for a portion or all of the stormwater programs. But there's some really good existing literature, including on the upper right of the current slide, the WEF's publication, Financing and Charges for Wastewater Systems, that lays out those methodologies very, very clearly. And again, we wanted to focus on those areas where there was a new contribution to be made. Likewise, impact fees, which again are often a source of revenue to support stormwater programs. There's really a pretty rich existing literature in that field. A lot of publications and conference papers, and there's actually an annual conference that is currently sponsored by the Growth and Infrastructure Consortium that has papers and panels that and really is putting out a pretty significant literature in that field. And again, the current document mentions some of these additional potential sources of revenue, but doesn't address them in any detail. So the target audience, and we hope a lot of you are on the webcast today, includes staffs and public works departments, wastewater and stormwater departments that provide leadership for stormwater programs, and all the folks that are parts of those departments. Really stakeholder outreach groups, finance departments, and again, depending on the organization and size of your sort of city, county, parish, or organizational province, it may be organized into separately as a separate finance department, or may be embedded within the utility department or authority, but the finance folks are definitely a part of the target audience. Information technology and GIS professionals who will be called on to help develop and maintain the data systems for the fee programs, and then consultants who support the utility fee programs, and again, that could include folks at a variety of parts of the process, engineering, legal, finance, stakeholder outreach. An important element or aspect of this document is that it was written by professionals for professionals, and if you pick up a copy of the document using the discount code that Rebecca talked about at the front end of the webcast, you'll see that there's a group of nearly 30 authors who made significant contributions to this document. And as one of the co-chairs of the task force that led this, we are in the debt of this full author team, which really includes the full gamut of water resource engineers, economists and rate specialists, GIS and IT specialists, attorneys who helped to draft the sections on legal context, and utility managers in terms of the management and organizational elements of the document. And we think that the document is richer for the fact that it was really written by a diverse team that runs the gamut of disciplines that are involved in both creating and maintaining user fee programs in the current environment. So I move now to an overview of the document, and this slide shows essentially the primary chapters of the document, and highlighted in red are the sections that are going to receive sort of featured presentations given the couple-hour time limit of the webcast. But and what I'm going to do as part of my sort of background and overview of the document is I'm going to sort of give some highlights from some of the sections that essentially aren't featured in detail. And so the document includes an introduction that talks about the audience, the purpose for the document, what it covers, what it doesn't, some of these elements that I've already been discussing. There's an overview section, a feasibility study, which addresses the full set of steps that one would go through to evaluate the feasibility and appropriateness of implementing a stormwater user fee funded program. Implementation phase elements, resource requirements, program evaluation and enhancement, and then a set of case studies. So in terms of the overview chapter, and Jim Bachhuber was the chapter lead for this section. I'm again just going to give a few highlights of some of the chapters that aren't featured in full presentations, but some of the drivers that are really significant these days in causing more jurisdictions to consider and look to forming stormwater user fee funded programs are really the economic pressures on local agencies, the set of headlines about bankruptcies and other financial challenges that many cities, counties, and other municipal agencies throughout North America are facing really are a key driver toward looking for dedicated funding sources for programs such as stormwater. And related to that, the competition for general fund revenues, which again, many municipal leaders have other purposes in mind for general fund resources and revenues. And then really the increased needs, the compliance needs, which are kicking in a number of situations for communities based on the permit requirements. But in addition to compliance, stakeholder initiated needs, that there are many, there's an increased in number of jurisdictions where watershed groups and stakeholder groups really are causing an interest in looking for enhancements to the level of service or the types of elements that are included in stormwater programs. And with that, we will turn to the Chapter 3 in the document, which is the consideration of feasibility studies. And the presenter for that will be Prabha Kumar. And I'll be giving a short intro to Prabha. Prabha is a director in the Management Consulting Division of Black & Veatch and has over 14 years of experience in assisting water and wastewater utilities with financial and management consulting services, including cost of service studies, metering and billing operations, review and optimization, and feasibility studies. She's the practice lead for stormwater utility consulting and has assisted several municipalities with all aspects of stormwater utilities, from planning and development to implementation and follow-on support. And she's provided expert witness testimony in stormwater cases and has been involved in Black & Veatch's biennial stormwater survey. With that, I will turn it over to Prabha.
Thank you, Mike. As Mike explained just now, with the increasing costs and requirements of stormwater program, user fee is becoming one of the tools to generate dedicated funding. While the focus of this WEF manual is specifically user fee funding, we do recognize as authors that a user fee sometimes may not be the only answer. A feasibility study certainly then helps a utility with a go, no-go decision as regards implementing a user fee. So Chapter 3 in the manual presents guidelines on conducting a feasibility study. So in this section of the webcast, we'll highlight some of the fundamental aspects of a feasibility study. So the first question is, what is a feasibility study? It's really a comprehensive evaluation approach that municipalities can use to cohesively evaluate all aspects of stormwater management, right from program definition to developing a user fee implementation plan. So it's really a comprehensive approach. So in terms of what's the benefits of a feasibility study that we have seen where utilities have done this, so first and foremost, it really helps with a comprehensive evaluation in building a compelling case, a case that is rooted in reliable information, clearly articulated justification, and really due diligence analysis of solution alternatives. The second thing a feasibility study does, it educates stakeholders. It really helps you to test the waters before plunging into a user fee program. In other words, it helps you get a pulse on public and political acceptance. Finally, a feasibility study also helps create both a strategic level intent of the program and also a more detailed tactical roadmap. And really the purpose is that risks can be identified and mitigated along the way. So in a nutshell, a feasibility study helps with informed decision making and really helps you take a long look before you leap. So what we have done in the manual is to define a framework for the feasibility study, and it involves 5 key focus areas. The first involves an evaluation of program needs and costs and priorities so that a level of service can be defined. Then we have to evaluate the organizational aspects, including legal authority, any jurisdictional issues if multiple municipalities are involved in a watershed, all the ordinances and policies that need to govern, and really the governance structure and staffing resources. Then we have to think about implementation, because there are a lot of one-time implementation costs associated with things like billing system modification, customer notifications, technology review, and so on. And all of these, program, organization, and implementation, all these have a direct impact on funding, and therefore a funding analysis is also needed. And the framework that we have proposed in the manual recommends that all these evaluations be performed with consistent and practical levels of stakeholder input, both internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. So the feasibility chapter goes into all of these in pretty much detail. So the key features of the framework really is flexibility. And the framework emphasizes logical organization of elements that need to be reviewed to build a compelling case. It emphasizes the importance of engaging key stakeholders early on in the process so that there are no surprises. So the key takeaway message here is that while the framework that is proposed provides general guidelines on what to address and how to address, we are not advocating that one size fits all. Rather, prior to initiating a feasibility study, municipalities need to first determine the depth and breadth of the study that you really need to do to build a compelling case. So in the interest of time, in this session of the webcast, what we are going to highlight is really just a few key issues that the feasibility study chapter really focuses on. And the key issues we're going to highlight are the program, funding, organization, and stakeholder engagement. So when it comes to stakeholder engagement in a feasibility study, really the issue is not should we engage stakeholders. The issue really is the extent of stakeholder engagement, because stakeholder engagement is absolutely critical. So why is it critical? First and foremost, it is important to educate them on program needs, the benefits, and more important, the risk of inaction. And the risk of not educating the stakeholders is that it will propagate a lot of misperceptions that utility managers would have to deal with later. Next, in addition to educating, it is critical to solicit input on key issues and concerns and understand the stakeholder perspectives. Now, educating stakeholders and soliciting their input provides a good sense of direction for the utility managers to really focus on policy issues and build consensus. And more important, significant stakeholder engagement and consistent involvement from early on in the study process really is absolutely critical for securing buy-in and support for the user fee program. Now, when we talk stakeholders, there are 2 categories of stakeholders. The first category is the internal stakeholders. We can look at them as kind of decision makers. This category includes really staff, a study team that is usually formed for a study like this, and administration executives and elected officials. On the other side of the fence, you have the external stakeholders. You could view them more as the impacted entities. They are the ratepayers, other government agencies, developers, financiers, rating agencies, and so on. So there are really distinct classes of stakeholders that need to be taken care of. So how do we do that? One way is to prepare a stakeholder plan. And a stakeholder plan is an effective approach that needs to be well thought out when it is developed. And that could address a variety of aspects. First, what kind of target groups do we need to identify? The target groups usually are unique to each municipality and environment. So once you determine what the target groups are, then it's important to know what the needs are with respect to their education on stormwater issues, their awareness of issues, and so on. That will then help really drive the level of outreach that needs to be done, the kind of messaging that needs to be done, and the kind of channels that you could use for messaging. And when it comes to stakeholder engagement, what we have found is that it is often important to identify a few key individuals, both internally and even externally, that would serve as champions for the process. And really from a practical perspective, it is also critical to define the timing of outreach activities. For example, research shows that stormwater issues soon after a major wet weather or a flooding event is more effective as it resonates with people. Next, talking about program, really a well-defined program is fundamental to establishing a defensible stormwater user fee program. So with respect to the program focus area, the manual provides guidance on all the aspects that should be addressed. In defining a stormwater program, it really involves, first of all, an evaluation of the current program and cost. So it's not only evaluating the cost of what the utility does internally, but also probably looking at stormwater costs associated with services provided by other entities within the organization or within a municipality. So you get the full cost of service. And then you have to also estimate the future program requirements and costs. And then by putting the two together, then using that information, a municipality can define what is called a level of service and prioritize program elements. So the first step is to really know where you are, evaluate your current program. And the current program review needs to address comprehensively all the operations and maintenance activities that you currently do, the capital infrastructure needs, and also the important regulatory and community needs. So all of these have a direct impact on program costs and funding, and hence all of these need to be documented. And here you could see some of these sub-items that you would be addressing under each of these categories. So once you know where your current program is, then the next step is to know where you need to go. Really, in other words, understand the road that is ahead of you. So again, this future program assessment has to identify the operating costs, the capital expenditures, the regulatory and community needs, and really then look at what are the elements that need to be addressed. And these specific elements that need to be addressed should be tailored to the specific environment of the municipality. For example, municipalities that have both MS4 systems and combined sewer systems really have to focus on additional combined sewer overflow related wet weather issues that they need to address when compared with municipalities that have to only focus on MS4 issues. So this understanding where the future program needs to be is very critical. Once the current program and future program evaluations are done, then you will really know what the gaps are that need to be addressed. So based on the gap analysis that you would do, then you could design what is called the desired level of service that the municipality wants to achieve within the next 5 to 10-year time frame. So when defining the level of service, the key takeaway here is that you'll have to strike a pragmatic balance between the level of service and really the financial capacity that the organization has to fulfill the program. So the important thing in developing a stormwater management plan or a master plan and defining the program level of service is to really understand that the program does not have to be a be-all and end-all right at the beginning. It has to be designed in a practical way to evolve over time. The next aspect of the feasibility study that the manual talks about is really legal considerations. This section was actually written by a law professor, Kara Milonzi from University of North Carolina, and she provides valuable information in this section, including citations from case law. So in this section, she highlights 3 common legal challenges that municipalities actually face when pursuing a stormwater fee funding. The first challenge is really whether the municipality has the authority to form a stormwater utility. The second common challenge is the nature of the charges, which I'll talk about shortly. And really the third one is, even if the municipality has an authority to form a stormwater user fee, whether they have the authority to charge specific classes of property. So these are kind of the 3 common challenges. So when it comes to, so the message here really with respect to legal considerations is that the scope and structure of a stormwater user fee program, it often becomes an issue of state legislation and enabling legislation. So with respect to determining if an entity has legal authority to adopt a fee, it's not only important to research the statutory and constitutional positions, but it is also very important to understand the procedural requirements. If the procedural requirements such as getting a voter approval, or for example in California, the Prop 218 requirements, if they are not fulfilled, that could lead to problems down the road. With respect to user fee, another common question that comes up is it truly a user fee or is it an? So it is important to understand that aspect. And typically, with respect to user fees, the courts usually cite some regulatory purpose. There should be some reasonable nexus between the fee and the cost of service. Again, it's not a perfect nexus, but a reasonable nexus. And a third aspect is that the fee should have an element of voluntary opting out, meaning if the user is able to control the stormwater, then they should have an option to have a reduced fee. So all these, again, enhance the concept that it is a user fee. And also the challenge is about whether fees should be charged on all properties or should some properties be exempt. That, again, is driven by any kind of an enabling legislation. For example, in the state of Virginia, the legislation clearly says that cemeteries cannot be charged a stormwater user fee, and the fee could be waived for that particular class. So it's important to understand that. The whole aspect of legal consideration is that you really need to understand all the risks before you dive into a user fee program. Another aspect of this organizational component of the feasibility study is focusing on policy issues. So why is it important to focus on policy issues? The answer is really simple. Policies affect every aspect of the program, right from the program structure to the organization to funding to implementation. So for example, in the program area, you'll have to determine if you're going to offer stormwater credits, and if so, how are the credit policies going to look like? Similarly, in the case of funding, there are a lot of policy decisions to be made on the methodology that's going to be used, the type of financing for capital projects, and so on. So really well thought out policies end up providing a very defensible roadmap for the stormwater user fee program. Coming to funding, this is an important area that the manual addresses in rather great detail. The funding analysis involves an evaluation of several components, right from determining the various funding sources to really rate structure and design. Again, to reiterate, user fee may not be the only funding source, but it is a very critical source along with many other funding sources. So in a funding analysis, it's important to evaluate the various funding sources that are available and align those sources to the cost. And that would result in a 6 to 10-year financial plan. The financial plan then essentially tells you how much revenues you need to generate from the user fees. In essence, it tells you the size of the pie. The next thing then you'll have to determine how to recover that revenue requirement from various customer classes, and this is where the user fee method, the rate structure, the impervious analysis, all of those come into play. So what are the key considerations when developing a 6-year or a 10-year financial plan? It's really important first to emphasize that there should be a reasonable relationship between costs and fees, and that's very critical. The second is to consider the funding mix, really leveraging the diverse funding sources like low interest loans, grants, and any kind of cost sharing that you could achieve. All of this ultimately helps with reducing the burden on the ratepayer when a user fee is established. And then it is also important to focus on, when you're doing a financial plan and looking at various funding sources, the level of dedicated funding you can get and the financial stability, and that's really where the user fee plays a critical role. And last but not least, the financial plan should really pave the way for an affordable rate. So sometimes you will have to phase in the rate when you're establishing a user fee, and that also needs to be addressed in this kind of a feasibility study phase. So it's very critical to consider all these in a financial plan. So then how do we develop a financial plan? We already talked about the level of service under the program component, where you've determined your operating requirements, we determine the capital requirements, and so that gives us a total requirement for the stormwater program. Then we'll have to look at the funding options, and here we have listed a few various sources, but the key one that we are focusing on in the manual is a user fee. So once you know what the various funding sources are and how much money you could get, then you can really determine how much do you need to collect specifically from user fee part, the user fee portion. So that's really how the financial plan helps you determine. So then once you know what you need to collect from user fees, then the question is how do you collect it? How do you slice it now to the various customer classes? So the manual again provides some very clear guidelines on these aspects. First is to define the customer classes. And the intent really here is to group properties that have similar characteristics into a class, like residential, commercial, institutional properties, and even undeveloped land as a class. Once the classes are defined, then you have to really look at what is the basis of fee that you are going to have. There are different approaches that the manual talks about, and it talks about the pros and cons of each. But the predominant approach that is commonly used in the industry is the impervious area, the actual impervious area as an approach. Now, some utilities do use impervious and gross area in combination. So once the fee basis is decided upon, then using the revenue requirements we talked about and the impervious area methodology that we've talked about, then the next step is to really bring the two together and determine what is called a system unit cost or unit rate. The unit rate is often expressed in terms of 100 square feet or 500 square feet of impervious area, or it's also referred to as rate per equivalent runoff unit. So this is also discussed in pretty much great detail in the manual. So all of these analyses need to be tailored to the specific needs of the utility. Then once that is done and once the system unit cost is established, then the last step really in the process is to do the rate design. And the manual discusses again a few options for designing the rates. For example, for the residential class, the common trend in the industry is to establish either a uniform single flat fee for all residential properties or a 3- or 4-tiered flat fee. In some cases, even for residential properties, the rates are individually calculated if that level of data is available. The type of rate structure that a utility is going to have is largely dictated by the level of equity the utility is striving for, and also the extent of administrative complexity that the utility can take on. So this is really a balancing act. For the non-residential class, typical standard in the industry is to have individually calculated charges based on each parcel's specific area, and this is because the non-residential properties are pretty diverse in characteristics. And Lawrence will provide some examples when he discusses the case studies. In addition to these residential and non-residential rates, in more sophisticated full cost of service recovery programs, such as what Philadelphia has, the rate structure could include also other components such as a billing and collection charge and a minimum charge, discounts for elderly citizens, and so on. These are all policy decisions that need to be done with a lot of due diligence and expertise. And then to enhance the concept of a user fee, as I mentioned before, it is also important to define potential stormwater credits so that properties that have on-site management will have the opportunity for a fee reduction. And this is also required in many state-enabling legislation. And again, like I said before, in some cases, depending on state legislation, you may also have to give some stormwater exemptions to some specific classes of customers. So all these have to be analyzed. And really, the important message here is that rate structure, when it is designed, needs to be flexible so that it can evolve along with program needs. As closing thoughts on this feasibility study section of the manual, first and foremost, the manual recommends defining the study objectives and principles and the level of stakeholder engagement that should be there. Then it goes into details on how to conduct the study with a certain level of due diligence. And then also it talks about how to develop an implementation plan. And now Mike will take over again and talk about the highlights of the implementation plan.
Thank you, Prabha. And just as a reminder to attendees, if you have questions as you hear the presentations, you're welcome to submit them at any time. We're going to hold the questions until all of the presentations, but if you have questions that are sparked by some of the presentation that you're seeing, feel free to submit them at any time. And as Prabha mentioned, I'm going to continue with a few highlights from a couple of the additional chapters that aren't featured in full presentations here. So following the feasibility chapter is chapter 4 in the document addresses implementation phase elements. And Vic Cooperwasser and George Remius were the co-chapter leads for this section. And again, I'm giving just a few highlights of from this section, which includes the steps for developing final budget data. In other words, once you've made the decision to move forward, there's always some sort of finalization to get to more accurate and final budget information. Determining the actual billing system, whether that's going to be separate or combined with other functions as part of the sewer or water bill, property tax, or freestanding frequency, which is in some situations governed by the selection of the mechanism. For example, if you pick to attach the bill to a property tax, in most jurisdictions that might be an annual or semi-annual sort of payment framework. Finalizing the rate structure and policy decisions, and again, during the feasibility stage, as Prabha described, you go through and evaluate the options, but there's typically some work to sort of finalize dot the I's and cross the T's for the credit policies, figuring out who the bill recipients are going to be, and the specifics of the enforcement program. In addition, during the implementation phase, there's the effort to determine the implementation phasing, figuring out the specific timing for the stakeholder engagement, finalizing the staffing, preparing credit manuals, adopting the ordinances, actually putting in place the billing system, and then addressing really some of the external issues, which include the political climate, the timing, just in terms of how it aligns with council and oversight body schedules and issues, the economic conditions, and how the program sort of fits in with that. So finalizing the budget for the selected level of service is a key part of this implementation phase activities, as I mentioned earlier, and part of that is really, and this is one of the tables from the document, is sort of just finalizing those decisions about the level of service, the frequency of some of the maintenance activities, based on input from stakeholders, what the budget constraints are for activities such as shown on the left, storm sewer cleaning, street sweeping, catch basin cleaning, sort of all of those key activities. And then importantly, having a schedule and clearly identified responsibilities is key to making it all happen. And again, I'm not going to read all the boxes here and go through this, but this is an example, again, from the document of identifying and delineating all of the activities that are in the public track, program track, funding track, data track, and really assigning specific responsibilities and schedules for all of these activities so that you can get to by your target date the implementation of the stormwater fee. And it's a lot of people that need to get involved across a lot of groups and organizations, both within the probably the host agency that is really sort of the focal point for implementing the fee structure, but also for other affected parties as well. The next piece of this is Chapter 5, following the implementation phase activities. There's a chapter on the resource requirements for the user fee funded programs, and Scott McClellan was served as the chapter lead for this effort. And so this, again, just as a sort of high level of some of the highlights from this section. it shows how the section shows how the resource needs really vary for the phases of fee structure development. That there are distinct specific resource needs during the feasibility study stage, during initial implementation, and during ongoing operation of the fee program. And there's a variety of kinds of resources that are really needed to make it happen. And it includes agency staff, but it also includes some hardware, software issues in terms of the billing systems and databases, and often external resources. And again, typically, it's not uncommon to need to draw upon resources from multiple internal departments or divisions, whether you're at a city or county or regional authority or agency, in order to address really all of the needed functions, both for the feasibility study phase that Prabha described, but also for the implementation phase. And again, the functionally, the agency resources that you need to draw on may be spread across several departments or divisions that would include, depending on the size and organization, planning, engineering, operations, financial, legal, and communications and public outreach. And again, some of the typical external resources that may be needed include, it's often useful to engage a stakeholder committee. There are others designated and interest groups that have a keen interest in whether a fee structure is organized and how it's structured. Outside government resources and consulting resources that may be needed to to help support both the implementation and then ongoing operation of the utility. And again, there's some predictable periods of peak activity during the feasibility stage, during the run-up to the first billing, when it's important to have some resources as the first bills go out to be prepared to answer questions, to provide, even with sort of extensive outreach and frequently asked questions and documents that are can be set up, or materials that can be posted to websites, there's inevitably a flurry of initial inquiries and questions as the first sets of bills go out. So that's an example of some of the predictable periods of peak activity. And so one of the resources in the document is an example of the staffing variation by phase that illustrates some of the periods where various groups and functions, both internally and externally, are expected to be sort of mainline resources and possible supporting resources, and it really serves as a guide to those of you who are at the stage of not yet having an in-place utility or a user fee-funded program, to think about the other groups in your peer agencies or other parts of your organization that you may need to secure commitments of resources to help support the various phases as you get to those stages. And so so we've covered implementation and then some of the resource requirements. The next part of the document is the chapter on program evaluation. And at the time that the initial guidance document was developed back in 1994, there really wasn't a section to address this, and that was in part because even though there were a number of user fee-funded programs in existence, there really wasn't sufficient history of experience with them to really create a framework for evaluating the programs and creating the opportunity for enhancement and review of whether the programs were meeting their objectives. But now, with the richer history of experience base, we really have the opportunity to do that. And so the next part of this is a presentation by Pete Yakimovich. And Pete is a principal consultant with Arcadis, and he's going to be presenting the evaluation phase chapter. And he has more than 30 years of stormwater management and engineering experience providing triple bottom line solutions to industry and local governments. He also serves as Arcadis USA discipline leader for green infrastructure balancing, funding, ecology, and social components of stormwater management programs. With that, I will turn it over to Pete.
Mike, thank you so much for that excellent introduction, and also to Prabha for providing a real good foundation for what we're trying to address in this chapter. I also want to extend a thanks to my colleagues at Arcadis who supported this work. This represents not just my efforts, but that of several other people. As mentioned, the original publication, 94, focused on development and implementation and did not have a section on evaluation of those programs, again, because there wasn't much of a history of it. But since that time, as we saw, we've got the number of programs has grown to over 1,300. And so this growth in established programs, has provided this depth of experience and knowledge that really is the context and source for this second edition and this chapter on program evaluation and enhancement. It is our conviction that this chapter provides some useful guidance for the many existing programs seeking to keep current, in this dynamic environment and to enhance their program. So the question, of course, perhaps is why, but this chapter provides the user, what we've done is provide a structured method and a tool to assess an existing user fee-funded program and to develop a proactive plan of action for program improvement. We're drawing on the concepts and principles and procedures, again, of the first 5 chapters, and this chapter, in a way, serves as a lens even through which we can better examine the case studies. In this segment, we're going to address some classic questions. Why should any program be evaluated? How may this be done and remain relevant to the specific program? And who should be conducting the evaluation and why? And what aspects or components of the program are to be evaluated and enhanced? This chapter also provides the user with a structured method and a tool to assess an existing user fee-funded stormwater management program, to develop a proactive plan of action for program improvement. Again, drawing on the concepts, principles, and procedures of the first 5 chapters, this chapter, provides a lens we can do it through. So I love this quote from W. Edwards Deming. Some of you know who that was. He's sort of the guru of quality management. But his comment was, it's not necessary to change. Survival is not mandatory. So, either you change or you fade away or you don't enhance, your program is not going to advance. So we try to identify the program needs in this way. First of all, we know that, as mentioned, that costs have increased, perhaps, and while revenue may have underperformed, and regulations have imposed new and different requirements. We've got new technology, as mentioned, that may provide the means for program improvements, both in efficiency, customer outreach, and even revenue enhancements. And state and local policy may require program adjustments, and of course staffing and organizational changes such as consolidation and integration may require some program adjustments. And finally, public perceptions, expectations are fluid and may need new engagement approaches. There is a need to manage public expectations. And perhaps as a last item here, some of these programs were launched and treated as a project. And the foundation on which these programs were initiated may have not considered how to go forward with an ongoing program. So, given the variables and differences of the many programs, the question is, how do we evaluate, enhance a specific program? How do we design of review that is relevant and adaptable to any user fee-funded program. Again, drawing on the first 5 chapters, they provide criteria, rationale, and a process for development of a successful user fee-funded stormwater program. And so what we've done is we've identified benchmarks of successful programs. The process that was developed here may be characterized as adaptive management. In some other realms, particularly industry, this is also referred to as continuous improvement. And that's really the whole essence. These programs need to be evaluated periodically in order to maintain their relevance and to keep up with what the advances have been. Now, key to the process is the establishment of these benchmarks for various program components that represent what we call as a level of program development. These benchmarks represent and provide a systematic and structured review of the program, if you will, a framework and a roadmap for improvement. The review and assessment process, again, may be repeated as often as necessary and may include some adjustment or even adaptation of the benchmarks depending on that specific program. A program adaptive scorecard has been developed to provide the user with a framework and a roadmap. Now, scorecards are a common mechanism in many settings. All of us have had a scorecard in our life at some point, even in grade school. And so wastewater utilities provide scorecards. So it's used in lots of different settings, and we thought this was an appropriate way to get a view, because the scorecard that we have provided here applies some benchmarks for the assessment of the program in terms of its development and progress. Now, we have to say that this is a diagnostic tool, but for practical reasons, it doesn't involve an in-depth drill down into all of the program components, but it does provide a management level assessment of major program components and direction for further in-depth analysis as may be indicated for that specific program. Now, we also designed the scorecard as a template to be user adaptive. It's been developed with common and universal benchmarks, but these things are flexible, and the program manager may choose to adapt and tailor benchmarks that are more specific to the overall mission of the program. Okay, some basic explanation of the basic scorecard design. We've divided into 3 major program areas with further subdivisions within the scorecard, as you'll see a little bit later. Now, the program areas are integral parts of the whole program, but they're designed to be scored and totaled separately, independently, if you will, to facilitate a clear assessment of the strengths and potential weaknesses in a particular area or sub-area. Now, we did this recognizing that many programs may be further advanced in one area over another, and that the scoring shouldn't, positive scoring or negative scoring in one area shouldn't drag the entire review down, so they can be looked at independently. Now, it also facilitates a phased and or separate reviews of these program areas. In other words, the functional area can be reviewed separately and independently. They all don't have to be reviewed at the same time, although that is kind of helpful because there's obviously a relationship between them. And also, we might say that the review cycle may be adapted to the results of the scorecard. For example, a scheduled follow-up review may be indicated by the results of an assessment and the action plan, and so that follow-up review can occur sooner rather than later. Okay, we've tried to keep the scoring simple, using a very simply a numerical score of 0, 1, and 2. The intent of the scoring is to determine where on a developmental level the specific program may be. Is it just developing? Maybe a new user-funded program, or it may have been in existence a while, but its development hasn't progressed much, or it's we classified it as foundational, or perhaps it's advanced. So what do these things? What do these levels mean? Well, a score of 0. If you score 0, that we have characterized that as indicating minimal development or even applicability of that particular benchmark. A score 1 indicates that the benchmark element is applicable and perhaps some adaptive changes are planned and underway. And a score 2 indicates that the benchmark element is well advanced, the program is mature, it's proactive, and importantly, it's considered a model by its peers. Okay, so who should use the scorecard? Who should evaluate and apply the scorecard? Who are the users? Well, we have to say it's possible the scorecard might be completed by a single knowledgeable reviewer. However, having said that, it's best and it's more effective and useful for the review to include a wider range of stakeholders. The wider the range of stakeholders, didn't mean to advance that slide, the wider range of stakeholders, the more effective and useful the review is going to be. Now, the review could start with operations staff, be passed on to management, could be peer reviewed then, or conducted by an impartial consultant. And I stress impartial consultant, and those of you who are listening will probably know why. Now, the review by policymakers and elected officials can serve as a tool to inform and gain support for aspects of the program that may need improvements. So you see, we've tried to design the scorecard in such a way that it can integrate with your whole public engagement and information program as well. The intent of the scorecard review is to serve as a basis for the engagement and participation of a wide range of decision makers and stakeholders, because this will facilitate consensus and support a plan of action going forward. Okay, let's look at how we might do this scorecard. So to do this, we've picked an example program. I do have to say that this is an existing program. Its identity is not provided simply because the evaluation has not been vetted by the program manager. So if you ask me, if you guess who it is, I'll say I can't deny or confirm. But anyhow, the purpose here is that this example demonstrates the independent review of the program by, in this case, a consultant that could be provided to program management and handed over to them for subsequent analysis and review and follow-up actions. They may agree or they may not agree with the assessment, or they may alter it, and that's fine. At least it provides an initial point of discussion to enhance or improve the program. So let's look at what this scorecard might look like. The functional program that we mentioned earlier, we've grouped these into two related areas, operational and the related cost of service. Now, this page of the scorecard, like others that we'll examine in just a bit, has been color-coded. And the reason we've done that is to gain a quick visual dashboard-like view and a rating. Now, looking at this scorecard, we see that in this particular case, capital improvements are highlighted in red because we've chosen red as a 0 score, and as such would merit some priority action. A few other items elements are scored at 1 with a brief sort of synoptic conclusion where we say, see attached report, for example, in 1A6. That is there. It can be attached as a report that says, hey, here's what we're doing. Here's the program going forward, and so therefore that's why it's scored a 1. Now, the total score at the bottom on this functional program you see is scored a 12 in this range. For 12 indicates that this is a pretty strong foundational program, but it could use some improvements, and perhaps the priority is the one area located in red. And the scoring here between developmental, the levels between developing, foundational, and advanced are really just levels. The advanced indicates that you're in the upper third of this scoring, and the foundational is in the middle third, and the developing is in your bottom third. So we've tried to keep it simple and not overcomplicate the scorecard. Okay, looking at the revenue program, we see generally a well-developed rate structure, some improvement potential in the area of revenue sources, but perhaps a weakness in the area of billing and collections. Now, the exemptions and credit component of the program that's highlighted in red here because it's scored as a 0, not because there isn't anything, but because the reviewer felt like it needed some work here, because there's some exemptions that are provided by code, but those aren't covered by supplemental targeted funds. They need to review legislative options, so there's some reasons given about what they need to do with this thing. I have to say that this component of exemptions and credits is what we found is sort of the potential Achilles heel in many programs. The legal basis in many programs may be weak and may invite challenges to the legitimacy of the user fee. We had some discussion on that earlier. And exemptions may undermine the rational nexus of the user fee. We'll hear more on this later from Lawrence. We also note a couple components here, 2A1 and 2B1. They're scored at 2, but there's some associated supportive reports and actions that validate the score. In other words, you may rate yourself a 2, but perhaps you need to provide some evidence for why that is a 2. Moving to the second page of the revenue program, we see again a area for rate and rate structure, and then we see credits and incentives. And again, the credit incentives area calls for some attention. Having been scored as 0, they really need some follow-up actions. Now, the reviewer here deliberately scored these as 0. The reason being is to keep a focus on the follow-up action items, and in part because this area is related to the prior exemptions component in the prior page, 2B4. Now, depending on the progress of the action items, the subsequent review may merit a higher score. Again, the purpose of this is to show the flexibility of the scorecard. We note that, however, at the bottom that the overall score rates this program as foundational and close to achieving a advanced rating with some work on just a few components. Looking at the management program, 2 potential weak areas are indicated in this first page. These 2 highlighted program components are frequently an element for improvement in many user fee funded programs. The cross-jurisdictional cooperation and state legislation are common issues for many programs. In this particular case, the state enabling legislation contains some language that is particularly troublesome, that at the time it was not a major issue, but now has become, as this program has evolved, it's become a more significant issue because it imposes a limiting factor on the area of service and inclusion of all users. We also note that some organizational and local code issues need some attention. So we move to the last page of the management program, and looking at this page, there's no red on this page, there's some yellow areas, but given the growing attention and emphasis on green infrastructure and low impact development, this whole idea of sustainability, at least in that context, has been included in the scorecard. Obviously, sustainability is a concept for the entire user fee funded program, but when we talk sustainability here, we're just limiting it to these areas. So we've included this in the scorecard since it's been flagged before as an area to look at. And the review reveals that we need to pursue a few specific components in this area of sustainability and public engagement. And so the action here would be, in one case for the participation that has been rated a 1, there's a web page for the program. Has some interactive features, but improvements are underway. So it indicates that this is a program improving. The program manager here could attach a report or other documentation to this, and that's the point of this scorecard. It's just a framework to provide some focus and a documentation for where this program needs to go. So finally, looking at the total score here, we know that the management program of this thing it rates a fairly high score in terms of being a foundational program, with right at the cusp of advancing to or going to an advanced level. perhaps with some priority attention to items 3A and 3A4 and 3B, as we mentioned in the prior slide. So finally, some conclusions for this evaluation of this particular program. One, the reviewer has rated this thing, it's got a strong foundation in all three major program areas, but some focus and action on a few key elements could probably move it along. And that's the whole purpose of the scorecard, is to just focus in on those areas that perhaps need some improvement. It really has the potential to be a model program, and very close to that. And finally, really, this whole idea of program enhancement and improvement is all part of a continuous improvement, adaptive management to improve the existing program. Lots of opportunities to do that. This is a way, the scorecard provides a quick look and a way for the program manager and the user to be able to map that out and provide a roadmap. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Appreciate your presentation. So the final part of the new document is a set of case studies, and Lawrence Vandertak is going to be providing an overview of this section, which includes nearly a dozen case studies. Lawrence has actually co-chaired with me the task force of authors who have developed this guidance document. Lawrence is Seastrom Hill's Deputy Director for Water Resources and Ecosystems Management. He has more than 25 years of experience in helping public and private clients to address stormwater and water resource issues. He has led feasibility studies and implementations for more than a dozen stormwater user fee programs in North America. With that, I'll turn it over to Lawrence.
Thanks, Mike, and hello, everyone. Now my screen is not advancing. Here we go. So my job is to review the case studies that are included in the manual. One of the things that we believe is unique about this version of the manual is the inclusion of all the case studies. So I'm going to provide an overview of those. I won't go through them one by one, but we'll try to highlight some of the lessons learned. I will touch on typical fees for single-family residential, and then talk about some of the exemptions that have been mentioned earlier. The lessons learned that I'm going to highlight include some of the areas related to how utilities are capturing impervious area data, what is new in credits and incentive programs, and what is new in rate structures. And as just a little aside, I've been monitoring the questions that you all have been posting, and I will try to answer a few of those as I go through this portion of the presentation, because I think it's best to do it in the context of some of those case studies. So first of all, as I mentioned, we picked 11 case studies for the 2013 manual, and we were really hoping to reflect on a whole range of issues. First of all, by geography, we have utilities in the U.S. and Canada across most of the country in both places. We have quite a range of size of utilities, from a small one in Florida with 16,000 people that it serves, and a couple large ones that approach a million in customer base. We're also talking about quite a range of utilities in terms of their age and maturity, from some of the earliest ones, which are largely in the Pacific Northwest in 1977, through one that was created just last year. Prabha spoke a lot about defining program needs, so we're trying to reflect the entire range of program needs, and lastly, a range of fee structures from flat rates to tiers and so forth. So as I go through these, hopefully I can highlight some of those differences and answer a few of the questions that I've seen posted already. So first, just a quick map view of the locations of the case studies that were included. There's quite a few in the eastern portion of the country, in the Mississippi Valley, and then a couple on the west coast from Portland, which is one of the earliest ones. We have several in California that are listed. The California case studies have the unique enabling legislation issue in California of having to deal with Proposition 218. I'm not going to get into that in much detail, but I encourage you, if you're faced with issues in California, to look at that case study, because there's quite a bit of good information on how Proposition 218 affects the ability of utilities to be created and the requirements there for having a referendum for new fees. And then also point out that we have Kitchener in Ontario, Canada included here. That case study focuses largely on Kitchener, but there's a summary table or two comparing to other utilities across Canada, so you can get more of a cross-section of what's going on in Canada by looking at that case study. This is a bit of a big, busy table, but was trying to have a high-level summary of a variety of issues for all the case studies, from the year that they are created to their size, typical annual revenues, whether they have tiers, their actual fees and credits, what billing mechanism they have in CSO systems. So as I said at the beginning here, we have quite a range of the maturity of these systems, from Portland, Oregon, that was created in 1977, to the newest, a couple of them that were, say, NURSD in Cleveland was in 2012, and the one in Kitchener, Ontario, was in 2011. So quite a range. A lot of the reason for the dates for these has a lot to do with the regulatory drivers at the time. Some of these are driven more by CSO programs, some of them by MS4 MPDS permits, and others by other drivers such as flooding. Again, quite a range of populations served, the smallest one being the city of Stuart, Florida, 16,000 people or 4,200 accounts, up to NURSD is about 1 million, and Montgomery County, Maryland is close to 1 million. So quite a range of sizes. Annual revenues, again, quite variable, from a low of 600,000 or so for Stuart, up to Portland, Oregon, which actually includes quite a bit of CSO, at $382 million a year in annual revenues. We'll talk a bit more about tiers, but this gives you a quick synopsis of how many tiers each of these are using, from some that have just a single tier for single-family residential to Montgomery County that has just adopted a 7-tier mechanism for single-family residential. Quite a range of fees. I'll get back to those in a moment, and quite a range of credit mechanisms. We'll talk about those also in a moment. I also wanted to highlight the range of billing mechanisms. Most user fee programs use either a property tax billing mechanism, including it as a line item on an existing property tax, or a water and sewer bill, and the driver for those choices usually has to do with whether or not you get full coverage within the jurisdiction by one mechanism or another. There's still some localities that are using separate bills, but that's pretty uncommon because it tends to draw attention to the fees, which is usually not desirable. And lastly, you see over here which ones are CSO systems and which ones are not. One interesting permutation is NURSD, which is a CSO system, created their utility to fund just their non-CSO areas, so that it only deals with part of their system. So Prabha covered a lot of these program elements before, and so did Pete, but just to reemphasize, some of the variation between programs has to do with the types of program elements that are being funded. It could start out with some jurisdictions that are CSO, focusing on the operation and maintenance components of those systems. And typically when CSO programs are funded, it's not the capital components. More often it's the operation and maintenance pieces that have to do with managing stormwater and catch basins on the street. In other words, managing the stormwater runoff before it gets into the combined sewer system. That's the case, for instance, in Richmond. Of course, MPDS stormwater permits often are a big driver. Different levels of minimum control measures required by those permits. That is a variable, as Prabha mentioned earlier. Question of maintenance of public facilities is often a driver. Montgomery County, Maryland's program was started out because they wanted to assume maintenance of facilities that had been maintained by homeowners associations and have since evolved to covering a lot more program elements. And then, of course, there are capital programs that can get funded through a stormwater user fee. Typically, focused on the MPDS permit requirements for water quality controls for their MS4 permit or TMDLs. But some other localities, the driver is more driven by urban drainage, such to provide quantity controls for flooding. For instance, in the case of Richmond, Virginia, they had quite a bit of historic drainage issues, so that turned out to be a significant driver for their systems. And all the photographs here essentially show some of the range of the types of things that are funded by these, from cleaning of inlets and catch basins, street sweeping, capital costs associated with green infrastructure, green alleys, green roofs, and of course I just mentioned urban drainage. So one of the questions that was asked as part of the webcast was, what is the range of fees that are typically experienced? We put together this summary. This actually goes beyond some of the case studies that are included in the manual, but happens to give a wide sense of the range of fees. These are all presented as annual fees, but one note I wanted to emphasize is some jurisdictions, specifically the ones that have water and sewer bills, typically bill on a monthly or semi-monthly basis, whatever their billing frequency is for water and sewer bills. So annual fees here range from a low of about $36 per year for single-family residents in Prince William County, Virginia, up to Portland's program, which is also the oldest program, at $237 per year for a typical residential bill. There are different colors on this map. In a sense, the colors are really conveying those systems that are combined sewer systems, from Richmond that has a low of $45 up to Portland that has a high of $237. And so I wanted to point that out simply because often combined sewer systems are used as a rationale for higher fees, but it doesn't have to be the case. It really depends which components of your program you are funding through this. So let's move on to talk a little bit about exemptions. Prabha spoke about this earlier in the context of enabling legislation, but it also relates to some broader policy questions that might be a significant driver. So one of the fairly common questions that comes up is whether or not the impervious area associated with streets and right-of-ways are actually assessed and charged. Amongst our case studies, from what I was able to glean from the write-ups, all jurisdictions actually do exempt the public streets and right-of-ways. The question that was posed as part of this webcast is why can't that impervious area be distributed to all the individual parcels? And I guess I would answer that as being a policy question that is up for debate. The real reason here is that the public streets and right-of-ways provide a common good to all properties, but conversely, there is a direct charge associated with maintaining those that everyone should assess. And whether you redistribute that impervious area or not, I think the fee per property would probably end up being very, very similar. So hopefully that answered the question that had been posed. It was mentioned earlier that in Virginia, cemeteries are exempted. That is because of their state enabling legislation very specifically exempts those. One other category of exemption that happens in some states is state-owned property is sometimes exempted explicitly in by state enabling legislation, but where it's not, usually those facilities are charged. And by the same token, question is whether the city or municipality-owned properties are going to get charged or whether they exempt themselves. Again, that's a policy choice of whether or not different departments should be charged based on whether or not they are maintaining their own stormwater facilities or not, and whether those budget items within the overall city or jurisdiction would get redistributed. One last area of exemption I wanted to highlight that Prabha mentioned earlier is the issue of hardship exemptions. Many of the earliest stormwater utilities did not provide for these sorts of hardship exemptions based on income level, but that does seem to be growing in importance. And actually, the state of Maryland just recently passed enabling legislation that specifically said hardship exemptions had to be included. But of course, they didn't specify how, and so the localities are trying to figure out how to go about doing that, whether it's done for individual properties or for all types of properties, such as nonprofits and businesses. So those are some of the categories of exemptions that are often considered as part of these processes. So let's move on to some of the other lessons learned. First one is fairly obvious, has to do with revenue needs, and as Prabha said before, revenue needs are driven by which program elements are covered by the program. But increasingly as larger capital items are being funded by user fees, we are seeing that there's an interest in including bonds to distribute those costs over time, and to leverage the stormwater user fee to support the debt service associated with those bonds is something that's being considered. And this is an example here from a client of ours that we're working with who's considering exactly this. So this sort of a program on the top actually shows, as their capital program ramps up, how much their cost would be if they paid on a pay-as-you-go basis versus if they were to issue bonds in that third year and distribute the costs over time with the debt service. One other area that we're seeing in terms of revenue needs is how to manage those revenue needs by leveraging other asset management programs. EPA is actually now encouraging integrated municipal stormwater and wastewater programs, and that actually also goes to things like repaving programs or ADA programs and so forth. How can you reduce or soften the blow of capital costs for stormwater by integrating across all of your asset management programs? We're seeing that more and more in some of these utility programs. Let's move on to talk about how to capture impervious area data and how that has evolved over time. First of all, talking about just the role of GIS and imagery as part of that. What's most common nowadays is to actually have aerial imagery that will support developing your impervious area data on a property-by-property basis. Historically, some of the earliest utilities, the impervious area was actually developed by either going out in the field and surveying a representative set of properties or actually just taking those off of as-built. But again, it wasn't done for all properties. But in the current day and age where aerial imagery is very common, that is the most common source for capturing your impervious area data. But it needs to be recognized that there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done to convert orthophotography that comes from those aerial flights into impervious area data sets on a property-by-property basis. One other challenge we have seen in a few localities has to do with all the different data layers associated with imperviousness. It's not uncommon to have some jurisdictions where one department might maintain the roads feature class in your GIS data. Say a public works department might do that, and you may have different departments, such as your assessors, that might manage the building data, and so forth. That does create a bit of a logistic challenge. The city of Richmond was struggling with that. They actually had 3 separate departments involved with between the roads, the buildings, and the parcel layers. And when it came time to actually get bills out the door, sometimes they found that the updates for those were not on the same cycle. So just being aware of where the data comes from and different departments is an important factor that does need to be considered as you are planning your process and moving into implementation. So as we move on from collecting data by imagery, at the very beginning, Mike mentioned that there's an increasing trend towards actually capturing the impervious area data using remote sensing. And we have a nice case study touching on 2 projects in the manual, one from Burlington, Vermont, the other one from a facility a property in Massachusetts. It gave examples of how to capture impervious area data using infrared satellite imagery and the whole process. So what this describes is the fact that, in principle, the purchase of infrared satellite imagery and classifying that into impervious area data can be much less expensive than if you have to convert aerial imagery from orthophotography and digitized using heads-up digitizing. Historically, the availability of that satellite imagery just wasn't there, but that is really changing rapidly in the last 5 to 10 years, becoming a lot more user-friendly. Some of the drawbacks of using infrared satellite imagery have to do with things like having vegetation overhang, so vegetation over the impervious area. You can actually see that in this image in the top here for South Burlington. There's some trees in this corner which actually are over this parking lot, and then if you actually look at the impervious area, those trees are showing up as non-impervious. So those sorts of things need to be reflected. There's also issues of bare soil. In this case, there's some bare walkways here. Those sometimes get characterized as impervious. And then lastly, depending on the size of the pixels in your imagery, you may have trouble capturing converting all that into impervious area data sets that have nice smooth boundaries. You can see here, the boundaries may be somewhat jagged. The reality is that those jagged edges probably don't matter, especially if you're using a tiered system. And the places that have done this have done so successfully without legal challenges. As an example, the South Burlington, Vermont effort. I mentioned that a lot of attention has to be put on looking at some of these smaller impervious areas when using satellite imagery. That was the case in the case study for Vermont. But the inaccuracies associated with those small areas can usually be managed if you have a tiered system where everyone within a certain tier have a flat fee. So maybe your impervious area may be off by 3 to 5%, but if you have larger tiers, that just doesn't affect what people are being charged. So that's a good segue into issues of equity and incentives. It is really becoming more common to use tiers for charging primarily single-family residential properties, but there are a few places now that are using tiers for all properties, essentially lumping them all together to different size classes. And then usually the larger properties or non-residential and multifamily use the actual impervious area data to charge those properties. Using tiers does provide the best balance between accuracy, i.e. essentially maximizing the fairness where people are charged directly in some proportion to how much impervious area they have, and of course the level of effort in setting up the impervious area data and coming up with the actual final billing data for those properties. An example of that, different tiers shown in the graphic here at the bottom. This is a client of ours who's looking at moving to a tiered system, and they're looking at whether or not to have, say, 4 tiers. In this example, tiers 1, 2, and 3 would have a flat fee for those within those boundaries, and then when you get above the threshold between tier 3 and 4, they would be charged based on actual impervious area for the large properties. And they're also trying to figure out whether or not to look at 7 tiers versus 4 tiers to get a bit more accuracy in the bill that people would pay. Usually this doesn't result in significant differences in the charges if you have more tiers. So again, there's a balance between accuracy, equity, and level of effort. The concept of an equivalent residential unit is increasingly losing traction given the availability of property level impervious area data in the ability to assign those based on a billing unit of 500 or 1,000 square feet. Prabha mentioned that earlier as one of the options that's being considered. But those two options are interchangeable. They can be converted from one to another, but it's sometimes difficult to explain to a typical homeowner what an ERU means and why they're paying more or less than one ERU. Let's move on to talk about accountability and public outreach. Many of these points have already been made, but they really show up in all the case studies if you read through them one by one. One of the first items that's really important has to do with reporting. Most stormwater utilities have to publish an annual series of performance metrics, typically related to their permit obligations, such as how many BMPs were inspected, the impervious area treated, the capital projects completed, essentially reflecting their level of service goals at the beginning. So it's important to get those reports out both to the regulators, but also to communicate them to the public. Lastly, of course, technology has been mentioned several times. Just having a webinar like this was unheard of 20 years ago as a vehicle to reach out to so many people. So technology is an important component of stakeholder outreach, both through the internet, social media, and of course using GIS and the mapping ability to communicate to the public what they are paying for and help build their awareness of stormwater and CSO program requirements. Call centers are increasingly used both at the outset of stormwater user fee programs because of heavy call volume associated with questions that come in. but then lastly, for ready response to complaints as they come in through the overall system. It's important, of course, to have high visibility and provide beneficial results from a program, and of course provide responsive service. This shows up in all the case studies as one of the strong elements of the more successful programs. Let's talk a little bit about incentive programs. These are increasingly used by most utilities to encourage installation of stormwater projects on private property, as well as to make sure that they are being maintained over time. And that helps the utilities with meeting their MS4 and CSO permit requirements. Incentive programs come in two forms. One is essentially rebates or grants, which is a one-time assistance up front with the construction cost of installing a particular type of facility or green infrastructure, such as maybe rain barrels or rain gardens. I've seen fairly commonly a limit of up to $1,200 for residences for those types of facilities, and a higher value for businesses that may have to install greater amounts of green infrastructure. And then the second type of incentive is credits, which is an annual reduction in fees that people pay based on the amount of impervious area that they are managing on their property. Some of the common elements that we've been seeing in credit programs is that it's fairly uncommon to offer 100% credits, but it has been done by some localities. The rationale usually for not giving 100% credit is that even if the property manages all of its stormwater on site, there's some amount of program requirements off site, either through maintenance of roads or managing your permit obligations, that still are required by the program. However, on the flip side, as was mentioned earlier, for legal defensibility, it's often cited that some sort of credit program needs to be in place. In the case of NEORSD, they felt that to be legally defensible, they wanted to have up to 100% credits as a possibility. Some of the early credit programs were only offered to non-residential properties, but increasingly, especially now that you can apply for these things online and using web technologies, they are being provided for all property types on an increasing basis. Some fee programs are split, as was mentioned earlier by Prabha, into a fixed portion that is usually associated with funding the off-site activities, and then the variable portion. And that allows you to essentially say that you can provide up to 100% credits, but only assigned to the variable portion. There's still a fixed fee. That's not uncommon to set up the fees that way. Most systems do require that you apply on a regular basis for your credits, anywhere between a 1-year to 5-year process, although I think some places actually make it indefinite. And the reason to have a regular renewal is, again, to make sure that facilities are being maintained. A common question that comes up is if you have a well-developed credit program, what should we expect in terms of revenue reductions? And in our experience, and as highlighted in a few of the case studies, the revenue reductions are typically less than 10% and more often in the 1 to 5% range. Just as a high-level summary, credits are really very, very different to reflect local policy and regulatory obligations. Some places provide them just for on-site quantity control. Example shown here, Raleigh, Chattanooga, and NEORSD. Some actually provide it if you actually manage runoff from off-site, off your property. Example also here of Raleigh. Actually, Montgomery County has just recently decided to do that as well. Some places only provide credits if you manage more than is required by your local stormwater ordinances. That decision was made by Raleigh. Again, that's a policy choice that needs to be considered locally. Some provide credits only for quality programs, and then some get into non-structural programs such as educational programs or integrated pest management programs or adopt-a-stream type of programs. Sometimes credits are provided for those, again, to encourage participation in the program, and sometimes, frankly, just to get support at the initial implementation phase. Increasingly, we're seeing some jurisdictions provide credits for trees and tree canopy. Chattanooga and Portland have programs along those lines, and some others are considering that as well. So that wraps up the review of the case studies. There's a lot of good information in the manual. I encourage you to take a look at those. Before moving on, I wanted to acknowledge all the different authors that were associated with those case studies. We had participation both from the jurisdictions or directly from their consultants. All of them are listed here on this slide. Again, I encourage you to go out and take a look at those case studies. They're very, very informative. And at this point, we are going to transition to questions and answers. But before doing that, I wanted to also acknowledge some of our other chapter authors. I think they're going to show up on the screen here momentarily. There we go. As has been said at the outset, this was a large team effort. In addition to my co-presenters today, who are all chapter authors, we had other chapter authors for many, many components of this document. They're all listed here, and this document couldn't have happened without all of their contributions to the process. And I would also like to acknowledge the fact that we had some peer reviewers, anonymous peer reviewers, and folks at WEF who were very, very involved in putting this manual together. Everyone made invaluable contributions. So with that, I think it's time for me to take over the Q&A. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Just a second. I'm bringing the questions up on my screen.
Okay.
Okay, we've had a lot of good questions, a few of which I attempted to answer as I went through the case studies. I'll try to summarize those again here, and then I will direct some of the responses to my colleagues as we go through this. Just one quick organizational comments. Rebecca's already answered, but several folks have asked whether the slides will be available. And the answer is yes, they will be on the Webcast FTP site for you to download after the talk. So one of the first questions that we got has to do with Black & Veatch's biannual study, and when was it last issued? So Prabha, since you are with the Black & Veatch, could you tell us what the last year of that study was issued?
Sure. Thank you, Lawrence. The Black & Veatch biannual survey, the last one was done in 2012, and I think the question also said where it can be accessed. It can be accessed from the Black & Veatch website. It is www.bsnboy.com, and when you go to that website, and if you click on the link that says brochures, you will be able to get that copy. And if anyone wants to send me an email, I can send a copy directly as well.
Thank you, Prabha. That is a very useful synopsis of state of variety of systems, and a lot of the policy questions we've talked about today are reflected through the questionnaires in that survey. There's also another survey document that's worth looking at, I believe is in some of our references. The University of Western Kentucky has also done a survey of stormwater utilities across the country that has a nice synopsis of where people are at today. Okay, moving on, one of the next questions here that I see is, does the manual compare how common single flat versus tiered flat versus individually calculated fees are relative to each other? I think I tried to answer that through my comparison of tiered mechanisms in the case studies. I think at least amongst our case studies, the newer utilities are definitely moving toward tiered flat type systems as opposed to individually calculated or single flat fees. There definitely are some, such as Chattanooga that still has the single flat fee, and others that are older that are evolving from a single flat to a tiered flat or similar structures. Do any of my co-authors, co-presenters want to add to that?
Lawrence, this is Pete. The only thing I would add to that is that I think it depends on how they set up their equivalent runoff unit. You know, one of the things we didn't show in here was that, but you mentioned that we're phasing away from the equivalent residential unit to a runoff unit. So when you start developing a runoff unit that's as low as 100 square feet, which I believe Gwinnett, Georgia has, then the issue of tiers sort of goes away. Because if you're measuring in units of 100 square feet, then you're basically measuring all the properties. But for purposes of residential, if you're down to 500 or 1,000, then obviously you're going to be creating some tiers. So a lot of that has to do with where you set up your actual unit.
Thanks, Pete. And as you just said, the breakdown between different units is an important part of that, and that again is balancing equity versus ease of implementation and how many tiers you have. Montgomery County, Maryland just went through an assessment of adding tiers, and that for a little while they seemed like they were headed towards using actual impervious area, but when they realized that their GIS data wasn't quite accurate enough to justify doing things down to 100 square feet or smaller, they went away from that and have moved towards a larger unit. Any other additions from the co-presenters, or I'll move on to the next question? Okay, the next question was, within the program rate structure, how would you address undeveloped urban property? Well, Prabha sort of got to this in talking about the rational nexus for programs, making sure people pay based on how much stormwater runoff they contribute. Yes, undeveloped properties, strictly speaking, do generate stormwater runoff, and there have been some cases where people have considered actual runoff parameters to assess fees for undeveloped properties. But most of the time, that is viewed as too difficult to do, and most often undeveloped properties, if they have no impervious area at all, will not be assessed a fee. That's the most common approach. Any other comments?
Lawrence, this is Prabha. Again, one of the common practices in the industry is to not just simply use only actual impervious area, because when you do that, then you run into issues like how do you charge undeveloped property that does not have impervious area. So one of the common approaches many utilities use in the country from a point of view of equitable cost recovery is for all the properties that have impervious area, they would use actual impervious area. And properties that do not have actual impervious area, like undeveloped land, we will use what is called a runoff coefficient approach. And there are some industry standard runoff coefficients that can be applied to undeveloped land. And typically the runoff coefficient is anywhere in the range of 15% to 30%, depending on soil conditions. And so utilities will then apply only for the undeveloped land. A runoff coefficient will be applied, and through that process, the units of service will be determined and they will be charged. An example of utility that does that is, for example, Wilmington in Delaware. They do that. Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, they do that. So there are utilities, and Dallas does that. So there are a lot of utilities that do apply runoff coefficient to undeveloped land to address that issue. And that is an equitable way of doing cost recovery.
Thank you for that clarification, Prabha. That's very true. There definitely are places that are doing that. My one anecdotal comment would be there are some localities when they tried to do that, they found it difficult to explain it to a typical homeowner. But it is the most equitable way if you are intending to directly tie runoff to what people are being charged. So that from a pure policy perspective would make the most sense to have that type of a system. And as Prabha just said, there are several precedents of folks doing that. Okay, the next question is one that I attempted to answer as part of the case study review, but I'll reiterate the question. Not including streets and impervious area calculations significantly benefits single-family homeowners, but does not reflect runoff stormwater pollution. What would be wrong about including the street area in impervious calculations and dividing this area by the number of parcels within the governmental entity and including this calculation in the total fee? As I attempted to answer earlier, there's really nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, what you say in your question makes perfect sense. But I think the point is, if you're redistributing that impervious area to all parcels, it probably wouldn't have an appreciable change in individual properties' fees. Again, a policy choice that is open for local consideration. These are all the things that make different utilities different and should be considered as part of your process. However, I would point out that is still fairly uncommon. I'm not familiar with any localities that are doing that at present, but maybe some of my colleagues are. Okay, not hearing any of my co-presenters speak up, I will move on to the next question. The next question is, have you found any city able to perform and implement an efficient feasibility study without the aid of a contractor? Well, being a contractor, I'll say absolutely not, but no, I'm just joking. Of course, if you have adequate resources and you go to the resource requirements component that Mike reviewed, there certainly is the ability to develop a utility without contractors. I do know of one locality that I believe did this entirely on their own, the city of Washington, D.C., but I would caveat even that in that they did get contractor support for developing their impervious area data sets. But once they had the impervious area data sets, which frankly they did for other purposes to support modeling, that could then be used to support evaluation of an impervious area-based fee, which they had recently implemented. Do any of my co-presenters, who are all contractors, want to speak up?
Lawrence, this is Prabha again. There is a utility that is not implemented yet, but there is a utility in Delaware that instead of using a contractor, they used actually some services from the university in the state. So that is something, and this is only because that particular university had a department called the Water Resources Agency that focuses on these issues, so they were able to get some help from that university.
Good point. There are several universities that have environmental finance centers that are getting increasingly skilled in understanding the subtleties of setting up and implementing a stormwater utility. That are definitely another resource that can be considered in moving forward with this sort of program.
Lawrence, this is Pete. I want to add to this thing. I guess I agree with you, but one of the things that might be missing from doing your own study, I mean, yeah, you can go to Google and you can figure out what other people are doing, but you may lack the experience that an independent contractor brings to you from other cities, because not everything is out there in research. I mean, there's subtle things that they can help you with. So that's not saying they have to do the whole thing, but I think it's helpful to have a consultant on board to some extent.
I would agree, Pete. Having been involved with a lot of these, and I'm sure all my co-presenters would echo this, oftentimes the value that we contractors bring really is in bringing the experience from other localities, lessons learned from other places, specifically when the elected officials and the public start questioning or challenging some of the policy decisions. You can reflect on choices that other folks have made and why they went one way or another.
Yeah, Lawrence, this is Mike. If I could just add to that, I mean, I think part of the consideration also is the timeline that that the agency is working under. I mean, if in some situations, you know, some of the agencies that we've worked with have had a pretty sort of near-term time horizon of, you know, wanting to get ahead of some increasing costs as some of the regulatory requirements were kicking into effect and so forth, and there was value in, you know, having the outside resources to mobilize and sort of work through some of those efforts. In some situations where agencies aren't on quite as strict a time frame, they might be able to go through, you know, some of the early steps internally, or some or all of them, you know, without external resources, if there's more flexibility on time. And I'm related to some of the comments by some of the other presenters. I'm aware of a couple of folks who have also sort of used some of the resources from the environmental finance centers at some of the universities as aids to that process, to either sort of work with folks to help, you know, develop a game plan, and in some cases it has helped to you know, reduce the amount of you know, consulting support that they've needed.
All right, the next question has to do with the scorecard, so I'm going to ask Pete to answer that. The question is, on the scorecard, is there anyone who has collected scorecard data, like in a database, for comparison purposes?
Well, the short answer to that is, not to my knowledge. The scorecard, we just developed it for this publication. And of course, I think the scorecard can be used to create a database as perhaps a standardized metric to make comparisons. And of course, we noted in it that I think somebody also asked related to that, is this a model program? Well, not necessarily. Whether it's a model program sort of depends on what your peers say of it as well. It's not just your own sort of self-assessment that determines it, other than the fact that you have scored yourself higher on these categories. So no database that I'm aware of, unless others of you are aware. This is a new development. You know that probably you guys have done these reviews, and the publications, but I don't recall seeing it structured as a scorecard.
This is Prabha. Yeah. For example, Black & Veatch does the biannual survey, and in the survey we ask a lot of operational questions. The challenge is if the questions we ask get longer, then the number of utilities that participate becomes low. So it's a balancing act, but we do try to get as much operational information that we can in the biannual survey, primarily for this purpose, because a lot of utilities do need some operational metrics. So we try our best to balance it and get as much information as we can.
Thanks, Prabha. Yeah, between your biannual survey and the Western Kentucky efforts, and frankly the institutional knowledge that's now captured in this manual, there is a lot of good information, but it doesn't sound like it's formally captured in the scorecard database format.
Right.
Thank you for your question. I think the next question might actually be focused on this scorecard evaluation process, but I think it's a broader question. The question is, in ongoing years, how do they reassess the efficiency of best management practice implementations? I think this is actually a broader question, just has to do with how effective different stormwater programs are at getting their facilities in the ground to meet their program obligations. I guess my sense of that is, as programs mature, usually they have a BMP or a tracking system, both for what's been put in the ground, but also for those that have applied for credits. And what's especially telling for a lot of these is those that have annual reporting obligations for MS4 permits will usually want to maintain that type of a database for how many have been put in the ground, when they were last inspected, and so forth. That is a database challenge. It's often hard to completely get your hands around, but more and more we're seeing localities use the web as, for instance, a way to apply for credits, and that credit system goes straight into a database that keeps track of what's in the ground. Do any of my colleagues want to add, Pete, maybe in the context of the scorecard?
I think the essence of the question is efficiency, and you can measure efficiency at the local scale, at the BMP level, but what we've seen is that typically you need to look at it at the program level or watershed level, and people are, of course, to do that, develop models and then monitor those models for indicators to see how their whole program of BMPs is doing. That's become particularly important with the implementation of a lot of low-impact development strategies and green infrastructure as well. So I think a good model of that is Onondaga County, New York, is doing that. So I would just mention that.
Thanks, Pete. Anyone else want to add? I think we're getting towards the end of the assigned time, so I want to keep moving through the questions so we can try to get through them. The next question has to do with how much detail does the publication provide on how to structure the fee credit, and particularly as it might relate to incentivizing green infrastructure. I think I gave some of those examples in my summary of the case studies, but I also want to point out that the chapter on feasibility studies as well as implementation do go into quite a bit of detail on how credit systems have been set up in other locations. And some of them make the clear distinction between the upfront rebate or grant program that will help encourage upfront installation versus actual credit systems. Oftentimes, if you do a calculation of what is the payback for implementing a facility based on, say, a 50% credit, you'll find that the payback is quite long unless you provide some sort of upfront grant or rebate program that helps with the upfront capital costs. So those things are important to consider, and I think there's good summaries of the range of credit programs both in the case studies and in the chapters on feasibility study and implementation. My co-presenters want to add to that?
I would just add that I think the primary value of incentivizing some of these green infrastructure or these other things is once you've covered the capital cost, then the maintenance, those incentives will tend to cover the cost of maintenance, and that's the crux of it. I think there are other incentive programs being developed to cover capital costs, but they extend outside of the user fee mechanism.
I agree 100%. And that's why I was making the distinction between grants and rebates for the capital costs versus percent credit programs.
Lawrence, if I may add, the credit programs are really vary from utility to utility, and there's really no standard right now in the industry on how a credit program is structured. A lot of it is to do with policy of the municipality. Now, having said that, and just like you pointed out, the credit programs, really the return on investment is very, very long. So the credit program by itself is not enough in a municipality to foster a lot of stormwater management. So now large municipalities like Cincinnati and DC Water and Philadelphia, they are beginning to look at more what kind of incentives, even if it is a one-time incentive, what kind of incentives can be given to really private properties to really motivate them to look into stormwater management. And so this is really, the incentives especially is really an evolving field right now that needs to be closely monitored as we go along.
Very true, Prabha. It is definitely evolving quite rapidly in many respects. The upfront rebate and grant programs, other types of programs, who's eligible, and all those sorts of issues. All those make credit programs and incentive programs fairly unique to each jurisdiction, and they are evolving rapidly. Thanks for that question. Let's move on. Go ahead.
Sorry, this is Rebecca. I just wanted to chime in here. We've reached the end of the webcast time. You guys are more than welcome to stick around and do some more Q&A, but I just wanted to let the attendees know that if you need to get to a meeting or something else, you can go ahead and close out the webcast. There's no need to stay on for the educational credit, and use that FTP link to complete the webcast evaluation form to receive your credit.
Thank you, Rebecca. Again, the presenters are willing to stick around here and continue answering questions, so we will keep at it. But if you have to go, we understand that you have to go. So the next question had to do with how we selected the case studies, and is there a database of existing utilities from which you selected? I think the answer to that is largely that we had a team of authors who have quite a bit of institutional knowledge, but we wanted to be sure that across our experience base we had good representation in all the factors that I was talking about at the outset here, based on geography and size and age and maturity, program needs and fee structures and so forth. So recognizing those factors, we essentially all came up with candidate case studies. Believe me, we could have added many, many, many more to hit on many of these issues. I'm sure there's lots of other great stories out there to tell, but we were somewhat space limited by overall length of the document. And our point was try to capture as good representative stories as we could.
This is Mike. I guess one point that I wanted to add is we haven't discussed it much on the call, but one of the case studies addresses California and all of the sort of unique context for funding stormwater programs in light of some very specific state legislative constraints and opportunities there. And so, in terms of some of the sort of Western experience, I think that there actually are 3 or 4 communities that are discussed within that that single case study.
Thanks, Mike. And the same is true for the remote sensing case study, which is really a compilation of a couple case studies in New England where remote sensing has been used. And in terms of the database, frankly, the surveys that we've talked about, both the Western Kentucky and the Black and Beach, probably have the best listing of available stormwater utilities that are out there. Next question asks whether does the guide provide a list with accompanying explanations of best program elements, and how do we know what the utility example is truly a model program? Tough question. What defines the best program element, to be frank, has a lot to do with what are your local drivers. So it's hard to say necessarily whether a program element is best or not. It does reflect your local politics and regulatory drivers and so forth. We did try to pick a range of case studies that reflect the range of maturity of systems. So not necessarily the best examples, but just the ones that show the range of experience that different utilities have experienced.
Lawrence, this is Prabha. Just as a clarification for the audience, again, the intent of this manual was to really be more of a guidance manual if municipalities are intending to look into user fee as a mechanism of dedicated funding. So since that was primary objective of this updated manual, again, the information that is there in the manual is not intended to be a compendium or a database of stormwater management best practices and best practice elements, because the focus was more on how should utilities go about looking into user fee programs. Just wanted to clarify that to the audience.
Good point, Prabha. Thanks for the clarification. All right, the next question has to do with the fairly obvious hole in the map I showed at the beginning of the case studies. So why no case studies covering the Southwest area or the Midwest? To be frank, I think that was not by conscious design, but more just because we had to limit the number of case studies we had to include. As it is, we initially started out with a target of, I think it was 9 or so case studies, and we ended up having to add a few. I have actually been involved with a few in the Rocky Mountain states, and in my experience, the lessons learned from some of the ones we already have in the manual do reflect some of those utilities experiences, with perhaps the exception of one in the Denver, Colorado area, which is a multi-jurisdictional utility, which we don't have a good example of in our case studies, but that is something that does exist out there where, say, a county and city have come together to put together a utility. I think it's largely space limited. Okay, the next question has to do with what's the size shown, 16,000 to 1 million for population. The answer is yes, but if you look at the table where the information was provided by the writers, I also provide separately the number of accounts. So it has one number in the table for the population, the other one for the number of accounts. But that first summary of 16,000 to 1 million is population. There is a note for the Kitchener example that includes stormwater on their utility bill, so water and sewer and natural gas. That is not uncommon, but fairly often it's just a water and sewer bill It may not have the natural gas component, but essentially that's a fairly common vehicle for sending out bills. And thanks for the clarification. Someone asked what a CSO stands for, and I apologize for that, but there is a definition of the various acronyms in the manual. CSO stands for Combined Sewer Overflow System. The next question I think we've addressed already. If the streets are exempt, how are the costs associated with these facilities recovered? Well, the fee is essentially defined by the total program cost that you have to address divided by the total number of billing units that are being assessed. So if there are costs associated with, say, street sweeping or catch basin cleaning and things in the public right-of-way, those are included in the program cost side of it. They are just assessed on the impervious area of the individual parcels.
Lawrence, I might just add to that. You know, in many communities, the actual exemption comes about because there's that service and the costs associated with that are provided by a street department or somebody. So there's already money being allocated to that, and so it's there's no cost associated with that directly. Let's say for managing the drainage system associated with the streets, for example. Although that doesn't cover, you know, the water that might come off the streets to go onto the system of the particular utility, but in part they are covered that way.
Good point, and that goes back to what Prabha discussed in the feasibility study components in terms of defining your program services that you're going to cover and levels of service for those. You know, some jurisdictions choose to include something like street sweeping, as you just described, and some do not. Just for instance, they may have street sweeping included in a solid waste or a streets program. So again, that's a policy choice on which components you choose to fund in your overall program.
Lawrence, this is Prabha. Even where streets, even in utilities where some kind of costs are incurred by the utility in managing stormwater in the streets, they don't necessarily charge the streets or the Department of Transportation that owns the streets for stormwater, mainly because one of the perception is that managing stormwater in the streets and medians and public right-of-ways that benefits everybody in the system, and therefore those costs really are collected from all the ratepayers through the regular stormwater rate. So it's a public benefit aspect as well as considered.
Yeah, I'd made the public benefits point earlier. Very important clarification. That actually goes to the next question. The statement was made here that public streets are paid for by property owners as part of the general fund account, which they pay into with taxes. Stormwater funding, unfortunately, also is taken from general funds in most cases. That actually is one of the main drivers for doing stormwater user fees, is the fact that there's competition for resources out of general funds, but sometimes those resources are not enough or vary from year to year because property taxes vary from year to year. And it really has to do with which component of street maintenance you want to include in your stormwater user fee or not. So it's a very good point. And sometimes when user fees are created, the argument is made that property taxes should be decreased. That is, again, a local policy question because you're transferring costs from your general fund to a dedicated fund that would be covered within the purpose area-based fee. I think I may have skipped over a question, perhaps. No. The next question I see, are other localities billing railroads? I think the answer is yes, but without a lot of success. At least in my experience. I know some localities are assessing bills to the railroad, but they're having a hard time collecting those. Do my co-presenters want to speak to that?
Lawrence, this is Prabha. With respect to railroads, again, there is a distinction. If railroads like Amtrak owns a property with their buildings and station and stuff like that, many municipalities will charge stormwater for those properties. When they say railroads, it's really the railway tracks which are in the public right-of-way. Those railway tracks are usually not charged for stormwater fee. But if they own a property specifically within a jurisdiction, those properties, including their maintenance yards and stuff like that, are usually charged a stormwater fee. And we have a lot of examples like that.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. My comment about not collecting had to do with the actual railways themselves. I believe there are circumstances where localities have tried to assess charges against those. But even for the public properties, sometimes there's a challenge collecting on those. I mean the stations and so forth. Thanks for that clarification, Prabha. Next question is, in your experience, what has been the most effective way of assigning a fee to multifamily housing classified zones? Also, how effective have municipalities been in charging fees to railroad companies? I think we just answered the latter part of that question. On multifamily housing, usually those are assessed by looking at the total impervious area of the entire parcel and then just dividing it by the number of accounts in the case of a condominium. But in the case of, say, an apartment building, which may have a single owner, usually the fee is assessed to the apartment, to the owner overall, and then they will choose to distribute that to their to the rental properties through their rental charges. It does require a little bit of work when processing the GIS data because, especially for condominiums, there's a one-to-many relationship for the number of property owners that are attached to the parcel, the common property, and so you have to figure out that relationship up front, but it's a one-time exercise up front when setting up your billing data, which can then be carried forward for future owners pretty easily. Does anyone want to add to that?
Lawrence, regarding condominiums, an important point, many municipalities will actually delineate condominiums as a separate class because condominiums could have residential condominiums, but there are also non-residential mixed-use condominiums like medical offices where there are individual ownership of units. So it's often helpful to delineate condominiums as a class of its own so that they can be addressed separately.
Yeah, that does help having them distinguished. Pete, were you going to add?
Yeah, I think the challenge with those commercial condominiums is how much of the total impervious area, if the impervious area is the metric to assign to them. You know, is it based on the area that they occupy within the building? Is it the frontal area? I mean, just how do you assess that? And that can usually be I mean, you make a decision, but there has to be usually some buy-in, perhaps, from the condominium association.
Very good point, and that sort of goes back to making sure that you have a well-established outreach process as you go through those policy choices. And that's definitely one of those billing details that you have to figure out early on is how do you assess those charges to condominiums. In my experience, it's just been based on the total number of units, but you can, especially with the commercial properties, as Pete just said, get a bit more sophisticated either based on the surface area of the property or its frontage or so forth. Sometimes it's simply driven by the data that you have within the existing data set, so that's often a driver for that.
Yeah, if the fee is not that large, it may not make a big distinction to add that sophistication. You know, so like you said, you have to kind of evaluate it each case.
Right. Yeah, sometimes just for policy reasons, it may seem better to do it one way or another, but after you look at it, you might find that it makes just a small percentage difference in an individual bill may not be worth the effort.
Exactly.
I have a question that seems to be somewhat truncated, but I think I'll try to interpret it. Next question is exemption for economic development. For example, a certain mayor waives all fees for one property and no other properties in the whole city has such an exemption. Is this legal considering Stormwater Utilities specifically says no exemptions? Well, that person is left who's asking the question, but the answer is usually no. The whole idea is to make sure that everyone is treated the same. Unfortunately, yes, there are exemptions that are included. It's usually best to make sure those exemptions are tied to state enabling legislation so that you protect yourself from future legal challenges. I know of one recent case in Maryland where they chose to actually set up a whole separate tiered system for nonprofits, where essentially the highest tier was capped. So the very largest nonprofits in churches were faced with only a much lower fee than they would have paid had they been paying based on the non-residential impervious area system. And that was a political choice that they made, which probably opens them up to more legal challenges down the road. But so it's best as at all possible to treat everybody the same, to try to avoid those special exemptions, which will inevitably raise the possibility of future legal challenges. Any comments?
Only just because you can do it doesn't mean you can get away with it, you know.
Right. Or you might get away with it for a year or two, then you might find that the whole utility is challenged, and then there have been cases where utilities have had to refund the revenues collected, and obviously that's a real problem.
Yeah, this is Mike. I guess the one point that I would add is that, I mean, there are some situations where, you know, a community has economic development goals and objectives, and, you know, may carve out a development district or development area and create special protocols that address a range of public service requirements, you know, as an extension of the concept of tax increment financing districts or other such mechanisms, and that utility fees and charges, you know, can sometimes be sort of wrapped into those concepts, but that where such exceptions are made, that it's important to have a logical justification for those. And, you know, just as the rate guidances for wastewater and water, you know, the WEF manual that I showed the cover of earlier of, you know, financing and charges for wastewater systems, and the M1 manual, the drinking water equivalent of that, I mean, identify sort of very specific protocols and to make some recommendations on when those sorts of deviations might be appropriate, and under what circumstances. And so if there's an interest in that sort of specific support to economic development, that, you know, I think some of those guidance documents from the other utilities may also be useful documents for folks to take a look at.
Lawrence, this is Sabha. I think the takeaway really is, if any kind of exemptions are to be given, it's not just, shouldn't be simply a policy decision, but it really should be rooted in some kind of an ordinance or legislative support. If you do that, then you're in good standing. But when you don't do that, then even if it is just done as a policy, it will have an element of arbitrariness to it, which could then potentially down the road lead to issues. So really a very, very strong note of caution when municipalities are thinking about exemptions.
This is Pete. One thing I would add to it, if you're looking for a strategy on how to do that, I would find a way to structure it within a credit system as opposed to exemptions, and to figure out how you can provide a legitimate credit for certain kinds of activities or certain kinds of areas, rather than an exemption.
I 100% agree, and the one example that comes to mind for me is in Prince William County, Virginia, when they were first considering this, the faith community was significantly opposed, but when, first of all, the need for the program was communicated to them, and then secondarily, when a credit was specifically structured that would allow them to reduce their charges if they provided some sort of public education program, and also would adopt, say, integrated pest management to reduce the applications of fertilizers and pesticides on their properties. Soon as they knew that kind of a credit mechanism was available to them, in addition to the more standard ones for structural BMPs, they got on board, and so that gave them a way to control their costs. Thanks for that question. Let's move on to the next one. It asks, in the case studies, what fraction of stormwater costs are covered by the stormwater fees? I don't think the manual actually articulates what percentage of total costs are covered by fees, but I can tell you that it's highly variable. and that has a lot to do with the evolution of programs, so in what the overall program needs are. Typically, as I think Prabha highlighted early on, there tends to be an evolution from focusing on funding one or two program elements. Oftentimes, those are just operation and maintenance or regulatory requirements for maintenance and so forth. And then over time, as capital programs become required by, say, TMDLs or other regulatory requirements, those might get added in over time. So I think the short answer is, depending on how much your operation and maintenance costs are of your overall program, it might be 20, 30, or 50% of the total program costs on an annual basis. You might start low on a percentage basis in terms of program costs, and then over time, as you get higher program needs, it can increase. And that probably is reflected, for instance, in Portland, Oregon's programs, $382 million in revenues a year and $270 per single-family unit. That essentially reflects them trying to cover 100% of their stormwater-related program needs or close to it. Most programs do not get 100%. There always is some other source of revenue. It might be some of the smaller things like plan review, erosion sediment control fees, and such. So I don't think 100% is ever the case, but usually they'll start small and evolve over time.
Lawrence, the Black and White survey shows about at least about 90% of the utilities that participate in the survey usually collect at least about 75% of their total program cost through stormwater user fees. At least that's the latest trend that we have seen in the 2012 survey.
Thanks a lot for putting a number to it. I didn't have a specific number in my head, but I think that 35% would probably reflect the operation and maintenance components on average, and then those who start funding capital do a bigger piece. But that's a more clear answer. Thank you very much, Prabha. Okay, the next question is, user fees should be charged of property owners to discharge stormwater from their properties to public streets. Streets are considered part of the drainage area of the county. Property owners pay for wastewater charges and trash discharges from their property, but the value has not yet been put across property to most cities for stormwater discharges. If the stormwater is not allowed to discharge from an owner's property, it would flood. I'm not sure what the question is here. I think I'm going to move on because I think that's just a statement. I'm not quite sure what the question is. Okay, next question is how are hospitals and universities typically handled from a user fee standpoint? I think we implicitly answered this earlier by pointing out that generally all properties are assessed a fee. And so typically hospitals and universities are also charged. The distinction might be if universities are public or hospitals are publicly owned. And this goes to the earlier comment about exemptions, where sometimes, say, city or municipality-owned property may be exempted because they may not want to cross-subsidize one department with another. But beyond that, usually those facilities are charged. Again, one other exception that comes to mind is some state enabling legislation might exempt state-owned property. And so if those hospitals and universities are state-owned, they may be exempted as well. An example comes to mind for Virginia. They actually were exempting state-owned property that provides its own stormwater management service. And so the Commonwealth University in Virginia, strictly speaking, could have been exempted under that. But when they were asked whether they were providing any stormwater services for the campus, the answer was no, so they ended up not being exempted under that clause. Do my co-presenters want to add to that?
Texas, for example, has an enabling legislation that explicitly exempts universities and schools of higher education. So in that state, those can be exempted mainly because of the enabling legislation.
Right. It seems to be a common theme. So the exemptions have to tie with that sort of legal document that would support it. Next question has to do with what's a good way to access stormwater utility annual performance metrics. Well, I would suggest both this manual, which has some good case studies on that, as well as the Black and Beach survey and the University of Western Kentucky survey have some summaries of how annual performance metrics are being handled. Again, I think I made this point earlier in terms of public outreach. A lot of those performance metrics tie directly to what MPDS stormwater permit obligations are for annual reporting. Anyone want to add? Okay, the next question is, how is street sweeping addressed in the rates? Is a portion of it included or all of it? We spoke a little bit about this earlier. It again has to do with your program choice evaluations right up front. What is often done as part of feasibility study stage that Prabha spoke about is to list all the program elements, including street sweeping, and then a decision is made whether or not to fund that through this program. And again, a driver is often whether or not street sweeping is required under an MPDS permit or a CSO permit. Sometimes the regulators are actually dictating that street sweeping be done on some certain frequency. And so if they are, then that regulatory tie can be tied directly to level service obligations and therefore funded under the program. But as Pete mentioned earlier, it might be in a different department. It might be in a streets department, so the choice of whether to fund it is a local policy choice in part of your overall evolution. Do you guys want to add to that? Okay. Next question has to do with the GIS. The GIS mapping extension software, is there an automated version that you have found to be most effective in determining impervious surfaces? I don't think this has to do directly with GIS mapping extensions, but I apologize. The authors of the section on remote sensing have a lot of details on these sorts of things. And there's reference to purchasing QuickBird imaging software in some of post-processing of the, specifically there's some specific software for ArcGIS that will actually allow you to do the categorizing of aerial imagery, but I'm not familiar enough with the individual add-ons to be able to name names, but I believe they are described in that case study for Vermont and Massachusetts, so I refer you to that. Next question is, what is the experience with establishing a cap for large users, both commercial and industrial, but most importantly for public and private school systems? I think we've kind of alluded to this in the course of the conversation here, that there's been a trend towards using tiers, and sometimes a cap is included inherently in that if you have a flat rate for the highest tier, but that is not the most common or frankly the most equitable approach to handling those. I believe it has been done. I gave an example earlier of a locality in Maryland that has put in a tiered system for nonprofits that uses a flat fee for the highest tiered property sizes. They have not done that for industrial and commercial properties, but they did it for nonprofits and churches. Do any of you all want to add to that?
Lawrence, there are some utilities that would have a cap specifically for undeveloped properties, even when they do it on a runoff coefficient basis. If there are very, very large properties, especially in wooded conditions, so they would say, for example, they would put a cap on like 5 acres. So up to 5 acres, they would charge undeveloped property, but beyond 5 acres, the assumption is it would highly be a wooded property and they would not charge. And there are examples. Dallas is one example that has a cap on undeveloped property charge. But it is not a cap on charge, but it's a cap on the acreage.
Right. That's when they're using the runoff coefficient approach to assessing a fee. Gotcha. So it's not common, but it has been done. I guess that's the answer.
The only thing I would add to that is that when you add a cap to these, basically you are redistributing who pays for and who the payers are. Because if you're trying to establish a certain amount of revenue and you eliminate contributors, then that revenue is then distributed elsewhere, and you could be creating a level of unfairness, if you will, or inequity. And so that's what you have to be cautious about.
That's exactly right. And when you evaluate different tiering schemes and different rate structures, you know, the equity principle is a big driver, of course, with this overall approach. But the devil's in the details, and if you put in a cap, as was just said, you might actually just require more to be paid by the smaller or single-family properties.
Hey, Lawrence, this is Rebecca. We have about 12 questions left. Maybe we can wrap up by like 3:45, do you think?
I'm willing to give it a try.
Okay, thank you.
I'll be a little bit more directive then and moving on through some of these questions. Next question has to do with, for an average municipality, about how much does it ultimately cost to develop, implement, and maintain this kind of program? Boy, I'm not sure there is an average.
That is correct, Lawrence. It's really difficult to have an average for something like that because municipalities vary distinctly in size and program that they have to deal with.
Yeah, and in the availability of associated data for impervious area information and so forth. So it's very difficult to generalize an answer to that.
This is Mike. I guess one point that we had some dialogue among the author team, and one of the points that's made in the book is that that a lot of it depends on the context, the availability of data. Do you have GIS ready to go? Are there going to be a lot of policy issues that require extensive information? I mean, I guess one point that is made in the document to give folks an idea is that you're conducting a feasibility study typically is an 8 to 12 month sort of effort, and it's not uncommon for the implementation phase to take another year or year and a half, given the issues that we've addressed. And so it's not a typically, and again, there's a lot of variation within typical, as folks are mentioning, but it's not typically something you can sort of say, well, let's do this and let's do it in 90 days kind of thing. That there is some time and some resources involved.
Mike, I could probably give an example of a client that wanted something done in this case it was 120 days, and the database work and all the sort of the technical work was done, but it didn't allow for that important public process and for the vetting of this thing, and so of course when it came to approve it, it just flopped miserably. Only to have to be then to go back and resurrect it and start over. So if you think you can get it done that kind of time, good luck. But you're just gonna. I think our advice to clients is you're gonna waste some time and effort and may poison the well, if you will.
Yeah, take the time to do it right and be very, very attentive to the stakeholder issues because it will help you in the long term. The next question is actually more of a statement. Trees are encouraged because they reduce the impact of stormwater on impervious ground, allow stormwater to infiltrate groundwater and replenish it, create shade, reduce heat island effects of cities, and reduce CO2 emissions. I absolutely agree. In the context of stormwater utilities, tree canopy programs are one of the program elements that are viewed on both sides of the equation. both as a potential cost that would be funded through the program to support, say, an arborist in tree planting activities. Then also on the other side of the equation, it might show up in a credit program. Both Portland and NURSD, and I think a few others in the case studies, specifically allowed the possibility of giving credits based on providing tree cover. So it's definitely to be encouraged.
I would only add to that, Lawrence, that some municipalities are looking at some more specific metrics for that in terms of having a certain amount of volume of water, for example, that is managed by the tree, and using that to differentiate, on some of these properties.
Yeah. Yeah. If you look at Portland's program, their actually percent credit for different types of program elements is quite specific, and I seem to remember in my head that they provide 8% credit for trees. And I think that 8% was derived based on the calculation of the amount of rainfall that trees are believed to capture versus overall runoff from a property and so forth. So it's that kind of logic that can be used to justify your overall program.
Right, and I don't want to belabor the point, but this is again why you wanted to look at your programs evolve. The regulations are now evolving where volume management is becoming a requirement within many MS4 permit programs. And so that volume management means that properties will have to retain and hold and basically do a hydromimicry approach on what runs off. And so some municipalities are now looking at that as the metric for how they would grant a credit, whether it be off of a certain standard. So if a property exceeds a certain standard and it's through the use of trees, for example, then they would be given a credit to the extent that that helps the case.
Absolutely. I'm going to move on in the interest of time. Next question, I think we've addressed, but probably needs to be clarified. Why only 50% credit for on-site BMPs? Why not 100%? I think the point we are trying to make is that the total fee is often split into a component that's associated with managing the runoff from the property versus the component that's associated with managing stormwater programs that are for the greater good, such as the road runoff, overall program obligations. Some jurisdictions will actually go through the process of figuring out how much that is, and it's not uncommon that that's roughly 35%, that off-site component, or 50%. And so how the credit is presented is really just a matter of whether you give 100% for the on-site component, or you just describe it as 50% for the total charge for the property. It amounts to the same thing. But the question is well taken. We understand it's essentially you should be able to characterize it as 100% credit for on-site, but recognizing that managing on-site stormwater may not drive the whole program's cost. Next question I think we've already addressed. I do not see much information for the center of the United States. Do you see any differences with the application of user fees and stormwater utilities based on geography? Well, my reaction to that, having worked on the utilities in the middle of the country as well as here in the eastern part of the country, is that the differences are driven mostly by the program components that are being funded, not so much by the overarching principles of tying it to impervious area and so forth. One difference, though, is there, as I think Prabha may have alluded to, there is more of a willingness in the central in western parts of the country to use runoff coefficient-based methods as opposed to just using impervious area-based fee mechanisms. But I don't think that you can generalize as significant differences based on geography. Do you all want to comment?
Lawrence, it's not an issue of, it's less an issue of geography, more an issue of system, and again how some municipalities, they don't collect any of the combined sewer system wet weather costs through stormwater, and some municipalities do collect combined sewer system costs through stormwater, like Philadelphia collects significant, an appropriate portion of the combined sewer wet weather cost through stormwater. So that's a big difference we see in the industry and less a geographical issue.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was the point I was trying to make at the beginning. It's just a function of which program elements you're funding, and those program things might vary by region. They might be based on the state or EPA regional preferences or focus. All right, the next question is, are any of you aware of any utility that charges for street impervious area? I am actually aware of some that charge for a street impervious area that is privately owned. So, for instance, a subdivision where the streets are privately owned and maintained, say, by a homeowners association. I do know of one instance where those are being charged. But again, it's not the public right-of-way. It's for privately owned and maintained streets. And conversely, those same streets are given credit for any maintenance and activities that are provided. Go ahead, Prabha.
Lawrence, private streets typically should be charged as part of, because it's part of the parcel area, private streets usually should be charged for stormwater user fees. The issue of streets and medians is really more an issue of public streets and public right-of-ways.
I know. That's what I said at the beginning. That's the most common distinction, and I think we addressed that earlier on in the dialogue. Okay, the next question has to do, how is disconnected impervious area handled? Some jurisdictions, especially those that have CSO systems, are providing credits for disconnecting impervious area, but usually the upfront fee before a credit is calculated regardless of what whether it's connected or not. And then if a disconnection program is put in place, you might get credit. Portland, Oregon is a very good example. Their first utility was driven entirely by the need to disconnect roof leaders from their combined sewer system. So that was their focus early on. They assessed fees, and then they actually to support that program, and then provided credits for those who actually did disconnect. Does anyone want to add?
In some places, disconnected impervious area is really treated as a reduction in impervious area. So when they calculate the impervious area for that particular property, they would actually calculate a reduced impervious area. That's one way to address it as well.
Yeah, it's technically it's probably the right thing to do, but it can be a real challenge whether the data is there to support it. So there's always this balance between data accuracy and ease of administration versus what policy-wise theoretically you should be doing. I'm going to move on to the next question. Most of the property non-residential owners do not see business case for retrofit. So very low uptake of credit programs. How can this be addressed? It's a very good point, and I think we addressed this early on. Credit programs by themselves really don't have a reasonable payback for them. So a lot of localities, Philadelphia Water Department is a good example, DC Water and a few others, have also used their fee program to fund a grant program to actually help with the upfront cost of installing facilities on non-residential properties. And this usually really benefits both the property owner and the utility, because some of those non-residential properties might contribute significant impervious area, have significant runoff, and if they may have regulatory obligations to manage those. So it behooves the utility in many cases to encourage those programs. But that is very much an evolving field, as I think Prabha said earlier. It's moving in that direction, but it's not commonly done. Okay, moving on to the next question. Is anyone building in controls or baselines to evaluate programs in that way? I'm not quite sure what that's referring to.
I'm not either. I noticed that person's left, but it could be referring to the scorecard, evaluate.
Yeah.
Again, I think there are folks out there that evaluate their programs on an annual basis. Whether they've done it exactly this way, I doubt it.
Right. Next comment, I think I'll skip over because it has to do with someone being a former contractor. The next comment is how often are rate structures typically updated or evaluated? What I would say is the rate structure itself is probably not reevaluated as often as the actual rate itself. So by rate structure, I mean whether or not there's multiple tiers and the billing units that are used and so forth. It's fairly uncommon that those get revisited on a regular basis. In my experience, it's more like a 5 to 10 year cycle. But the actual rates per billing unit, some places will do that on an annual basis. That's quite common. In other places, in the interest of having some rate stability, we'll reassess that on a less frequent basis, say a 3 to 5 year cycle, which typically might say correlate to either a MPDS permit cycle or to a CIP program cycle. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, the other factor involved there, of course, is sort of looking at the revenue and their cost of services and to make a determination whether they need to make an adjustment.
Right, right. And that's why the connection I just made to permit cycles and or CIP cycles. Those obviously are big drivers for needing to make an adjustment. Agreed. Thanks for the question. Next question I think probably might be for you. Is there any info in the survey about the success of utilities or municipalities securing bond financing? I personally have been involved with a couple utilities that have done that, but I don't know whether broad statements can be made. Prabha, is that question asked in the survey?
Yeah, we do ask about bond financing, and there are a lot of utilities that do bond financing, but there's not a specific question on the success rate. There are a lot of municipalities that do bond financing for stormwater programs.
Yeah, especially as the capital programs are growing, that obviously becomes greater interest to spread those costs over time through bond financing.
My sense is, though, that the type of bond is probably a general obligation bond and not a revenue bond, unless the user-funded program has been in existence for quite a while and show a track record for their user fee.
Right. I think the next question has been answered. Someone's interested in hearing the answer to the question on the fraction of stormwater costs that are covered by stormwater fees. I believe, Prabha, you said in your survey it was about 35%. That is in the range that I think I was quoting based on my experience as well. So, but it's really not a set number. That might be an average, but it really varies based on which program elements you want to fund.
Yeah, I said 75%. 75% of the costs are usually covered by stormwater user fees in mature utilities.
No, I'm sorry. I misheard you the first time. Okay, I think we have just one remaining question that hasn't been answered. So in Virginia, if they have their own MS4 permit, then they would be exempt from fees. I think the answer to that is yes. In the state of Virginia, the enabling legislation specifically says if you're an industrial property or a state property, if you have an existing MS4 permit that you are in compliance with, you are exempted from a local jurisdiction's utility fee. Okay, I think that's all the questions. Lots of great questions. Thanks to my co-presenters and all the authors and participants in this process. It's frankly been a great experience for me personally. So hopefully those of you on the line who stuck it all the way out to the end have found it to be useful. The manual is coming out any moment now, so get your orders in, and feel free, of course, to download these slides and reach out to any of us if you have any further questions. And Rebecca, I think that's it. So can we wrap it up?
That's it. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
The organizer has ended the session, and this call will be disconnected. Goodbye.